Well, then I'm going to welcome everybody to this event. My name is Rick Laubscher, and I'll be your moderator today on behalf of the Niles Film Museum. And we are celebrating two anniversaries today, more or less. The big one is the 115th anniversary of the 1906 earthquake and fire that changed the face of San Francisco forever. The other is the almost resurrection of the greatest single artifact from that era, which is a motion picture film made by the Miles brothers as a professional venture, and which was restored for the first time really by Rick Prelinger of the Prelinger Archive, and deciphered by David Kiehn, who is the head of the Niles Film Museum. And as a result of the work of those two gentlemen, 60 Minutes did a story that the reporter Morley Safer said was one of the favorite stories he ever did out of 900 that he did for 60 Minutes. And we assume, since most of you are here either because you saw this on Facebook through the Niles Film Museum page or the Market Street Railway page, that's my organization, that you've seen the film, but we're here to discuss it, discuss the 60 Minutes event, and answer questions that you have about the film in particular. So let me introduce our panelists here, starting with David Kiehn. David, can you please nod? And that's good, who is the head of the Niles Film Museum, a wonderful organization in the East Bay in the very historic enclave of Niles, where some of the very first movie westerns were made 100 years ago. Also, Rick Prelinger, head of Prelinger Archive, who has done more than anyone I know to save both contemporary and more distant cinematic history, not so much through Hollywood movies, but even more valuable through the movies taken by people themselves, home movies and other means. And Rick is a professor at my alma mater, UC Santa Cruz, professor of film and head of department, I think now, so congratulations on that. And then we have with us, we're very privileged to have with us two descendants of the Miles brothers, Scott Miles and Duane Miles. And there were, correct me, gentlemen, if I'm wrong, there were 5 Miles brothers or 4? 5? Four. Well, I'm rounding up.
And one daughter.
Why don't we start with Scott? Scott, you tell us your relationship to the filmmakers, and then Duane, you tell us yours, and then we'll get into this.
Okay, Earl was my great-grandfather. Hand off to Duane.
Grandson.
Duane is Earl's grandson.
Okay, there you
My
go.
uncle. Yeah.
Okay, well, with that, let's start. Scott, why don't you tell us, or Duane, both of you, tell us a little bit about who the Miles brothers were and how they came to make this remarkable film.
Well, you know what? I'm going to have to tag David Kiehn on that because, as I call him, my family historian, he knows a lot more than I do about that.
Well, let's go right to the expert, David.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, the Miles brothers grew up in Ohio, and Harry, the oldest, learned how to become a photographer in Cincinnati. And a little while after that, his next oldest brother, Herbert, joined him in Cincinnati. And together they managed to get a contract to shoot still photographs in Cuba. And after that contract ran out, they decided to go to Alaska and shoot not only stills, but also motion pictures for the first time. Other people had been up. I think the Edison Company had been to Alaska before and shot motion pictures that didn't really turn out very well. But the Miles brothers, the first two Miles brothers, Harry and Herbert, were very successful in Alaska and shot about 5,000 feet of film there. And because of that, they set up a theater in Seattle, Washington, to show these films. And it lasted about 6 months, just showing these movies over and over until the audience for them kind of dwindled to nothing. And for whatever reason, they decided to go down to San Francisco to set up a shop there in 1902. And first started making films in collaboration with the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company in New York, and then set off on their own to shoot films. So for the first couple of years, the films that the Miles brothers shot in San Francisco were actually copyrighted by American Mutoscope and Biograph. And Herbert Miles set up an office in New York, first in the Biograph building, and then across the street from it. Harry was located in I think it was 116 Turk Street in San Francisco. And during this time period, they brought in the two younger brothers, Earl, and then the youngest, Joe Miles. And not only were they making films, but they were also renting films. And they became one of the largest rental organizations in the country.
Renting what?
Having the advantage of having offices on both coasts, I think, helped them out tremendously. And with four brothers who could be trusted, I think that became a very strong organization.
Okay. And maybe Rick Prelinger, can you tell us when you first encountered this film in your work?
I'd known about this film for many years because it's been used by experimental filmmakers like Ernie Gare, and you see it in a lot of San Francisco history films, but you see a terrible copy. You see the same sort of fourth generation low res copy made from a 16mm neg. I had the fortune in the early 90s to run into a man named Burt Gould, who worked at Palmer Laboratories for many years. Burt had a large collection of Bay Area history, including a lot of 35mm nitrate film, which he copied by himself in the lab. And this was one of the films from his collection that we acquired. I don't know whether he got it from the Mileses or from the descendants of the Duane family, who were another veteran longtime production company. He possibly might have also gotten it from Frank Vale, who was a camera person who lived to a venerable old age. I met him when he was 98 and still making apple cookies in his own kitchen. And he shot the PPIE when he was the 1915 World's Fair when he was probably 16 or 17 years old. So it might have been in Frank's collection as well. This is an original copy, one of the prints, probably off the original neg with a little bit of replacement footage. And it looks like it's the best condition copy, although there's some bits and pieces missing, and there's no titles at the main and the end, the head and the tail. So there's some mysteries there, which David Kiehn is the man who, what mysteries haven't yet been resolved, I'm sure he will.
Ward Kimball had another beautiful print. Unfortunately, that I think the nitrate deteriorated, and as far as I know, all that was copied was a 16mm negative that for years Murray Glass rented out. And you could also get a copy of the film from the Interurban media company. I'm not quite sure what it was called. Rick has heard of the Interurban.
Interurban Film. It's a Southern California organization that does
Yeah.
books and old vintage films. Yes. And so Rick Prelinger, this was not the Library of Congress copy, which was the copy that everybody had seen, the poor copy. that never came into play. You didn't use that, need it, or anything else, right?
No, and I think that might have come from a paper print. Was that a paper print, David?
They never copyrighted it, so it never had a paper print.
I see. So that was a somewhat lower quality film copy, which they actually do have a little postage stamp video of it online through the American Memory website.
They've been
So-
talking about making a better copy of that because, you know, this was done 25 or 30 years ago, I think, transferred to video. And so they could probably get a better version than what they've had online before, but they've got a lot of things to do, I suppose.
I mean, this kind of speaks to the fact that there's a lot of times there's no fixed authoritative versions of old films. And the only reason we can tell what's there and what isn't there is because we know the ride down Market Street. You know, we have Market Street to restore the continuity. So that's sort of the ground truthing of that film. And that's what makes it so wonderful. You know, we know how it's going to end. It doesn't really have a plot. Other than, you know, the cars clowning around, and I think that's just kind of wonderful. When people watch it, they're just watching the journey without any other expectations. And this film, as you all know, has sensitized more people to what archives are all about and what archivalness is all about than anything else. I'll save my stories.
And I would also say that it sensitized more people to that era of history in San Francisco, which no single still photograph can adequately convey. Rick, would you tell us, when you first saw this higher quality print of the film, what your vision for it was and what you hoped to do with it to make it even better?
We transferred it to standard definition video just to have a copy. You know, film is a wonderful thing, but it's heavy, it smells bad, you have to take care of it. It's you know, it's sort of evanescent. And we put the standard definition copy online at the Internet Archive, a nonprofit in San Francisco, as part of putting a lot of our collection online because we wanted to share it. This film, honestly, it belongs to the world. You know, we may own a physical copy of it, but it's a film that's part of the history of every San Franciscan, and it's really, I think, part of world history as well. So we were never terribly proprietary about it. We made a new negative, and I will still sell prints of it at cost to anybody who wants one in 35 or 16. You know, we don't make any profit off that. And then when it became possible to make a higher quality scan of it in 4K, we did. It was a little scary. Adrian Finelli scanned it actually at 5K, and she was worried that she would, while she was running the machine, that she would destroy the sort of the master copy of this amazing film. But we went down to like 3 or 4 frames a second, and she did a beautiful job, and nothing broke. And here we are. But it belongs to the world.
Let me remind those who've joined us that this is an Earthquake Centennial event for the Niles Film Museum in Fremont, California. And we're here to talk about the landmark 1906 film from the Miles brothers called A Trip Down Market Street. And David Kiehn, you saw that this film, as it was registered or as it was tagged in the Library of Congress, said 1905, but you thought that that wasn't right. And you did some magical detective work. Can you share that with us?
Actually, my first assumption was that it was right. In 2005, the Exploratorium sponsored an event at the Embarcadero to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the film. And a good friend of mine, Sprague Anderson, shot a recreation of it on Market Street. And they set up a big screen and projected it as the original and the remake. and I assume some other things too. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go there to see the event for whatever reason. But that kind of sparked my renewed interest in it. I've seen the film many times before, and didn't really think anything of it in particular in terms of the filmmaker, but that event sparked my interest in trying to figure out who made it and when. And I went through all the newspaper microfilms to see if I could see some kind of report in the San Francisco papers. I started looking in like August through October 1905, every single day on the microfilm. It took me quite a while to go through every page in all of the newspapers that are on microfilm. San Francisco had 5 newspapers at that point. So I was a little bit surprised when I went through all 3 months and didn't find a single reference to the film, because in those days, making a film in a very visible place like Market Street, you'd think somebody would write something about it. One of the key points of this research was that Rick's film was already up on the internet. And so because it was the best looking version that I'd seen, I was able to even read license plates on the automobiles. In those days, San Francisco California had started licensing automobiles in 1905. And so it wasn't a surprise to see license plate numbers. In fact, there was one license plate that was the number 5. So going through finding those license plates, I was actually able to track down original records at the California State Archives in Sacramento. Unfortunately, they were handwritten and they were alphabetical, so I had to go through practically every listing, because a couple of the license plate numbers that I found were in the W's. And I also tracked down a license plate collector who had monthly bulletins, and found out that 2 of the license plate numbers, one of them was issued in January of 1906, another one in February of 1906. So that was another indicator that it wasn't 1905, but it was 1906. But the first clue to figuring out that the 1905 date was wrong was looking closely at the film and seeing water puddles on the street, and looking at the weather reports again through August to October 1905. There were no references that showed there was any rainfall at all during that time period. But in looking at another reference, I might point out that the Library of Congress, when they had their version up, and a very detailed description of every building you see, and saying that they had based their September 1905 date on the Ferry Building clock, which you can see in the film, and the angle of the sun, giving a kind of a time of year reference. And I realized that there was another time of year where that would more or less match up, and that would be in March or April. And because of the state of building construction on Market Street, it wasn't possible that it would be March or April 1905, but March or April 1906 was possible, but not after that, because you can see obviously in the film that those are cable cars, not trolley cars. The line was electrified after the earthquake, and cable cars no longer ran. So that pinned it down to March or April. And then the really telling reference was finding the Miles brothers advertisements in the New York Clipper magazine for April 21st and April 28th, 1906. And that spelled everything out that showed that the Miles brothers made the film.
This is remarkable and dogged research on your part, for which I think the world should be very grateful.
It took months, yes.
Yeah, and I want to just interject here that we do take questions. So those of you who are on this call for the original live webinar can go to the Q&A bar at the bottom right and click on that, and you can ask questions in writing, which we'll direct to the panelists to answer. After you've done this detective work, both of you, I guess, heard from a source who made this turn into something national and even international, and that's 60 Minutes. Was that you, David, or you, Rick, that heard first?
David Browning contacted me first, I believe. And it's because of my wife, Rena, who had noticed all of these different versions showing up on YouTube and everybody referencing the 1905 year. By that time, this was in January of 2010. By that time, I'd known about the Miles brothers and the date 4 days before the earthquake of the filming of the trip down Market Street, and had done a little bit of outreach, promoting it at our annual earthquake anniversary show at the Edison Theater in our museum, writing an article for a local history magazine, and talking about it wherever I could. But that was a limited number of people knowing about it. And Rena finally posted a comment on one of, or several of these postings for a trip down Market Street on YouTube, saying about my research and pinning down a date. And as a result of that, I started getting dozens and dozens of emails and phone calls asking about my research. And I think it was about April of 2010 that David Browning called me up and we talked for about an hour, and then he had some follow-up questions that he emailed me, and trying to get, as much information as that I had gathered about it. And talked to Morley Safer, who was totally on board for doing a piece on it, and they presented it to the people at the top at 60 Minutes, and they approved it, and it went from there.
And then they contacted you, Rick, at David's reference?
Yeah, I heard he actually contacted me, God, I don't know, in 2009 or something like that, and tried to sell a story to his bosses about it. And then he started to talk to you, David. I sent him a DVD of, a pretty decent quality transfer. And we had a chat. I'd had some dealings with 60 Minutes in the past, so I was a little bit of a known quantity to them. But I wasn't the story. I was just the vehicle, so to speak. David's work was the real story, made it relevant.
Well, and the other David Browning, who couldn't be with us today, is really the CBS hero of this. Morley fronted this piece, as they say, but it was David Browning's passion and desire to see this made that got it through. It's not the kind of story that would typically rouse New York. But of course, Morley Safer's buy-in to it was great. And then you two gentlemen were gracious enough to put my name down as the head of the nonprofit Transit Preservation Society in San Francisco. And we arranged to have the oldest operating rail vehicle in the Muni fleet used to simulate the filming, to replicate the route that the cable car ran. And that was one of the most delightful moments of my life. And the vehicle in was actually an electric streetcar because, as you said, David, cable cars, the same kind that run up the hills of Powell and California Street today, or will soon again, was the vehicle literally that dominated Market Street. There were a few horse cars on the bottom end of the street by the ferry building, but everything else was very large cable cars, to which they had attached a camera, like maybe somewhat like the one over Scott's shoulder up there on his bookshelf, but some sort of camera. We've never seen, correct, a photograph of the camera rig that was used, and we don't know much about it, but I am totally fascinated by this because it seems almost impossible to do this without being very visible to anybody who was going down the street. So can we delve into the realm of speculation here a little bit and ask what any of you, the Miles gentlemen or David, what this might have looked like, this rig?
I think it was just a camera on a tripod, and that was very easy to set up. After my initial research, and the newspaper started coming up online that you could do keyword searches, I actually found an article in the San Francisco Call newspaper with I think about a 3-paragraph article about the Miles brothers requesting the use of a cable car from the Market Street Railway because they tried to shoot it from an automobile and it was too bumpy. And amazingly enough, in tying in with Rick Prelinger's attitude of this film belongs to the world, that's exactly what they said in the article, that this Market Street film would show San Francisco to the world. And that was their intent right from the beginning. So they had their studio at 1139 Market Street, which was just past 8th, where the film was shot. And I think they just put the tripod up, put the camera on top of it, right out from the front door of their studio building. And it didn't take very long to set up, and then they were ready to go down Market Street to the ferry building.
I've watched this film 100 times from a transit aficionado's perspective, and I see some things that are fascinating and would like to talk to you about. First of all, we've all heard. Let me just say that there are, as you know, dozens of versions of this on YouTube, and I got a little irritated, I'd have to say, early on to see this version with music, ethereal music attached to it that was getting millions of views.
The sound effects one drives me nuts.
Well, and then sound effects, but also there were, the comments you would see seemed kind of uninformed to me. People didn't know what they were seeing. That led our nonprofit, Market Street Railway, to research everything we could about the San Francisco of the era, especially the transit operations at the time, so we could explain, as the cable cars rolled by in the opposite direction and the people cross the street and we see the buildings, what you're looking at. And we also, in the lower right-hand corner, captioned the intersection so you knew where you are on Market Street compared to today. It's all very straightforward if you know the city well. And even though this is before the earthquake, it's rather amazing because of our unusual street grid that 115 years later, you can look at that film and say, oh, well, that's 6th Street, that's 5th Street there. But there are other things in there that were very interesting. And the first one were the automobiles, because the most common comment people make about the film when they see it online is, oh, there were no driving laws. Everybody's going everywhere. They're, look at all those automobiles. But David, you found out there really aren't that many automobiles in the film.
No, there aren't. And the trick of that was that most of them drove by, turned around up ahead, and then circled around behind and came by again. There was one car by a San Francisco chauffeur named J. Barry Anway, who drove by 6 times. He held the record.
Do you think, and this is probably speculation, do you think the Miles brothers recruited some of these drivers to show up, or just told people they were going to be filming?
Yeah, that's total speculation because, of course, there's no written record that I could find anyway. But because they signaled in the newspaper that it was going to happen, that might have clued in some people. I haven't been able to find any direct connections between the Miles brothers to the drivers. That was one thing that I was hoping to do due to the license plate numbers. But I don't know for sure, but it certainly seems suspicious that there wasn't any collaboration there between the two.
And then we have some questions coming in, and one of these bears on this. It's from Ted, who does say how much choreography on the street was done for the movie. So we don't really know quite how much.
No.
One thing that's interesting to me, again, from a transit perspective, is that, while cable cars ruled on Market Street, there were other kinds of cars, rail vehicles that were operating in San Francisco that crossed Market Street, namely electric streetcars. And these were a fairly new phenomenon in San Francisco, and the United Railroads, which later became Market Street Railway, which ran all of the transit service essentially at that time, did know, of course, that the Miles brothers were going to be filming there, did know that the cable car with the camera was coming down the street. And as I've looked at it very closely, and this may be supposition on my part, I see 2 intersections. One is 4th Street. A streetcar comes across right in front of the camera right away, just before the cable car gets there. And then the next block, 3rd Street, a streetcar marked sightseeing car also crosses right in front of the camera. And in the latest enhanced versions of the film, which incorporate information in the sprocket holes, where in between the sprocket holes, it looks to me like that sightseeing streetcar is kind of waiting on 3rd Street. There are no traffic signals, of course, for the cable car to reach a certain point before it crosses in front. And I know this is only speculation, but I wondered whether this was United Railroad saying, we're going to do a little commercial for ourselves here. Come to San Francisco and ride the sightseeing car, which was something you paid $0.25 for, and you got a 3-hour trip all the way out to the Cliff House and back on and around Land's End on a streetcar. And that terminal for that line at that time was Poston Market, so it was only 2 blocks away. So I found that fascinating. And then similarly, you see on Lower Market, you see a buggy pull right in front, almost hit the cable car, a horse-drawn buggy, with with a little boy looking out the back of the buggy, like he knew the cable car was there and what it was there for. And then a block or 2 beyond that, a horse car comes in from California Street and again cuts right in front of the cable car. And all of these things seem to me to be not coincidences, although we can't really prove that.
Well, I think there's one definite thing there, and that the Miles brothers had to arrange with the United Railroad to use that specific cable car, so they would have specified a day and a time to do it. And word certainly could have traveled fast about what was going to happen.
It's interesting. Do either of our,
Rick?
go ahead,
Rick?
Scott.
What was that story you told me a while ago about how there was a theory that the cart with the boy in it might have belonged to them?
I was merely speculating.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
I don't want to commit you to
it
anything.
looked like it could have been a photographer's truck. What was interesting to me about that is that you only see the back of it, and there's a little boy in the back poking his head through the canvas curtains on the back of the wagon. And then another young man looks around from the driver's, or at least the seat in front of the cabin, and you can see that he's African American, which is interesting because 0.5% of San Franciscans were African American in that decade. So it was just an interesting and unusual thing to see in San Francisco. We know, of course, that there was an active African American population because one of the most famous of all the earthquake photos by Arnold Genthy shows an African American family dressed in their finery, standing on Clay Street, looking down at the fire advancing from the financial district up the hill. And so that was interesting. But what this does is what the film has done, in comments everywhere, has unleashed very interesting comments that make assumptions sort of based on today's reality and not on what was actually going on in 1906, which makes it so interesting to find that.
What we call presentism.
Presentism. There's another historian friend of mine from UC Santa Cruz takes a different aspect of this and calls it retrospective moral judgment. That you judge something that happened, 150 years ago based on the standards, the moral standards and values of today. Very hard for anybody to measure up to today's standards 150 years ago. But, and likewise, the same thing there. We got a question from a Pat Booter who says, do Scott and Duane have any stories of the filmmakers, of the filmmaking activities of their forebears? Can you?
I wish. I really wish we did, but they predated us so much. Duane, I don't think Dad knew Earl at all, did he? I think no. So that was about as close as we could get.
Yeah, he was going, Earl was going in the 30s, early 30s.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because
his son, Harry, did not say anything about, Harry was around during your time, wasn't he?
My father, Harry, or Harry, the brother?
Yeah, Harry was
Grandpa Harry.
Earl's son. Yeah, so yeah, your father didn't say anything, Duane, about
No, just that they were here and they photographed movies, and but I was little, so how much do you take in?
Mm-hmm.
Which is really too bad.
Well, what you do
look
have,
at that! Look at that! That's great.
That's Earl and my grandfather Harry. I don't know what year this is, but I love this picture. It's and they have
1915.
Well, the film continues to get attention, and not all of it accurate, certainly, and not all of it helpful. I don't know how many of you have seen a meme that popped up, or a social media post that popped up quite a while ago, a few months ago, I guess, on and got it's a YouTube post of the film that simply says, the year is 1906. A young student with a camera turns on his camera and and captures this magical film. And I know I shouldn't get my blood pressure up about it, but the facts are so easily accessible. And what happens is that, and I don't understand how this works, how social media works in this way, but that version of the film has gotten literally millions of views. And this is posted from some random person. It's not posted by the Library of Congress or the Niles Film Museum or any organization. It's a random person. And I actually tried to track the fellow down and send him a note saying, would you please revise this statement? Got no
Yeah,
response.
we let him have it for that one. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
it's they just used search engine optimization to get to the top of the heap, and all these folks are selling ads and making money off that. But I think the thing is that movie buffs don't care about facts the same way that railroad buffs do. And if you rely on like IMDb for accurate information on films, you're going to find yourself, people believe what they want to believe, and they project their own feelings onto that film, and whatever. It's out of the bag. I can tell you. I mean, if you don't mind, there's this version by a man, Denis Shirayev, in Russia, where he has colorized it and supposedly smoothed it out and brought it up to 60 frames per second. And it's supposed to be an enhancement. And actually the visual quality is very poor by comparison to the original film. But that's something that I actually find a little more disturbing than some of these misconceptions, because what this guy's doing is turning archival records that have a lot of authenticity into fiction. And we see this big trend now, with the colorization of historical photographs and with these so-called enhancements. People are going to get a little more interested in the fictional versions than in the real versions. And, that film's been smoothed out, which in my opinion is a mistake, because even though the camera might have jogged around a little bit, but the roadbed wasn't smooth. So it's not very accurate. And so it's a little bit like Gresham's law that, the bad versions might be driving out the good over time.
yeah. David, do you have that same view?
To a certain extent, Peter Jackson's version of the World War I footage I found very fascinating. And, I think there can be two parallel tracks. You preserve the artifact for what it is, and if you can enhance it and find some details that you couldn't see otherwise, I think that's valid too, because that creates a search for information that maybe you wouldn't be able to discover otherwise. And I'm always looking for discoveries. So, I think they can both survive in a parallel course, as long as the original is preserved for what it is. I know there's a big controversy in the film preservation world about how far you go with a film preserved, and you're already creating a compromise when you digitize it and put it on a computer screen. That's already a change there. So you'd have to really go back and project the film on a hand crank projector and recreate the experience that way, as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to be a purist. There are so many things that you can lose just by a digital transfer. How fast the person is cranking, you've got to make a judgment there if you're going to video about how fast the transfer is going to be. So
Well,
you've got all kinds of complications.
One of the things that's helpful here, you mentioned, Rick Market Street providing a template or as a point of reference for the film. We know where we are. We also know how fast the cable cars ran precisely. And so, with some math and things like that, we can figure out what the speed of the film should be.
Yes.
and I want to address something that a viewer forwarded to us, saying it was not his view, but somebody else's, who called this thing doubtful. And he has some arguments that simply don't hold water. And I think Rick is responding to him by type. But he says, this film probably dates from the early teens. The film quality is way too good for 1906. Movie making was in its infancy, and films of that time were short, poorly exposed. Well, that's kind of a retrospective judgment, because if you look at the Library of Congress version of this film, yes, it's poorly exposed. It's fuzzy, but the Miles brothers did this for money, and they put it. They were exhibiting it in presumably what, vaudeville halls, would you say, or something like that?
It was actually designed for a viewing experience called Hale's Tours, which recreated a railroad car, and people would look at it as if it was traveling down a road.
Really?
This was a short-lived viewing experience, but in the Miles Brothers advertisements of April 21st, 1906, they specifically say it's for the Hale's Tour.
I see. Okay. And how big would that screen have been?
Only about 6 to 8 feet wide.
So not a whole lot bigger than some of the gargantuan home video setups.
No, most movie screens in those days were fairly small as well. If you went into a Nickelodeon theater, you wouldn't get much wider than, say, 10 feet.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I was hoping actually a couple years ago to show this new 4K transfer at the Castro, which is a beautiful room with the screen. How wide's that screen? 35, 40 feet?
Well, if you go behind that screen, you can see the original Castro Theater screen that's still there. And it's not much bigger than the one we have here in Niles, which is 9 by 12.
I'll tell you the problem. They couldn't run the 4K. And it ended up being reduced down to high def. So that film is actually, I mean, I don't know if you've shown the 4K down there at Niles, David, but that's not been seen. This is an opportunity. We got to get the biggest screen in the world and get those people to be life size.
Yeah,
That would be really fun.
it would, yes.
Yeah, but that's something to do when the pandemic lightens up. Maybe we could talk about that, when people can gather again.
Yeah,
Another place I'd love to take this film, and I haven't had good luck with the bureaucracy, but I'd love to show it in the airport to greet people landing in San Francisco. Maybe the Market Street Railway has some clout that I don't, but I think that it would be a wonderful welcoming.
I think that would be great. I think that would be great. So that's certainly something to think about. And I will raise that with some people I know.
Yeah.
Because that could be great. Because you could take a 4K version of that and it would dazzle people, and coming off through the terminals. So
I was coming into SFO from an international trip one day, and they're not always the friendliest folks at immigration. And the man said, "Business or pleasure?" And I said, "Business." He says, "What's your business?" I said, "I'm an archivist." And he says, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, that film of Market Street in 1906, and bang goes down the stamp." And he says, "Welcome home."
That's great. That's great. Other stories about the 60 Minutes piece that anybody that we haven't covered that people would like to hear?
I would say that as a result of that piece, I got even more email and phone calls inquiring just how I discovered it, and almost like in some cases demanding real proof that it was an actual discovery. There was one really nice thing, the granddaughter of J. Barry Anway sent me a picture of her grandfather uh, so that I could actually see his face, because all you see is behind him as he goes one row after another around the cable car. So that was neat to see.
That's wonderful. That's a great story. Do our and does anybody else have a comment on what's going on here? Because I have one question. If not, the question is: this was filmed hand cranked. How many frames per second did it come out at? 14, 12, something like that?
Every cameraman that shot in that period will tell you it was 16 frames a second. Now, whether that was really true because every cameraman was different and had their own rhythm, who knows? But as you pointed out, knowing the speed of the cable car, of course, there would be a judgment of whether that still looks correct or not. But I think it's probably pretty close to 16 frames. Most of the videos that you see on YouTube seem to have slowed it down a little bit, I think. So it's like the people are floating as they walk by.
I'm just checking to see what we scanned it at, because I think we found that 16 frames a second was a little bit, yeah, we scanned it to 16. I had a feeling it might have even been 12 or 14. The version that's online is interpolated to 24 frames a second, but it's still at 16. 16 looks pretty good. I'm watching it right now.
And 24 interpolating means what? Doubling every
That
second?
means for the video, it's just throwing in extra frames, but it doesn't make the speed any different.
And that's technically required when you convert?
It's required to, how can I say this? Why is it required? I don't remember. I think because we can't play back at 12 frames a second in most video players.
I see. Okay.
Or 16 frames a second.
Okay. When I watched this colorized version you mentioned, I assume is the work of the Russian gentleman. Can you tell me, just as a curiosity, how one goes about colorizing a motion picture like this? Is this artificial intelligence or is it something else?
He's doing two things. He's using something called Topaz, which is software that you can buy now that actually supposedly cleans up some of the detail, but he was taking it off of YouTube, so it already looked terrible, right? That's one thing. And then there's software that allows you to set a basic color palette for like faces and signs and cars and buildings. And then once you've done that, you just hit a button and it goes and fills things in.
One of the things I found interesting was that this was a transition period in the liveries of the cable cars. United Railroads took over the Market Street cable cars in 1902. And before then, all the cable cars were painted in to match the lines they ran on. And this was done so that you could see the cars coming from a long way away and know that, oh, there's the ivory car that goes to Castro, and there's the blue one, and that goes down Valencia Street. So I'll wait for this one, which is kind of clever, but it also limits the flexibility of how you operate your fleet. So they started repainting some of the cars into a dark red, and we see a mix of cars on Market Street. But fortunately, they all have dash signs on the front ends that say where they're going. And that lets you discern what color the car's front should be. And I noticed in the colorized version, I mean, it's poor colorization in that it's kind of fades in and out. It doesn't deal with shadows well, and everything is kind of pastel-y, but on the cars. But the colors seemed fairly congruent with the actual colors, and I just wondered whether this fellow somehow knew what color these cars were supposed to be and did the research to figure that out, or whether there was some program that discerned from the density of the grayscale what the actual color should be.
Those automatic, those AI colorization programs, they've been criticized because all the colors are very washed out. It's some kind of, it's almost like an ideological conception of what the past looks like. The past had, if you look at Kodachrome of Market Street from the 30s and 40s, it looks gorgeous. Colors are bright. And the colors of all these AI colorized films look like old pictures that would come from the portrait photographer that colorized them with inks. So
Right.
It's a game. It's fun, but it's not anywhere. It's not researched.
Do you think it's going to get better? The accuracy?
The technology is going to get a lot better, and the accuracy is just how much work people put into doing that research.
One thing we've noticed with our preservation organization and our photo archive is that, you know, we have quite a few photographs by transit fans taken in the late 40s, when color film, Kodachrome particularly, became affordable and widely available to hobbyists. And those photographs get many times the level of interest as the black and white photographs from the same era. And I see comments now and then from, and when I check on their profiles and things like that, they almost are inevitably younger people who say, oh, well, you know, this now it looks like something. It didn't look that's just old. And that's frustrating to us because we're interested in the human beings as well as the railway equipment, the people who actually operated it, and you know, and what their lives were like, and what the lives were like of all those people walking up and down Market Street and crossing in front of the cable car and so on and so forth. And we would love to see more people, today's generation, get involved in that. Do you see that kind of thing, that kind of divide among younger people?
Honestly, I don't. I mean, I think there's some, you know, I think there's some spectators that like a lot of razzle dazzle, but I have no problem getting my students interested in black and white films if they're interesting films themselves.
Great. Scott and Duane, can you tell us a little bit about, did you have interactions with Morley Safer?
Oh yeah.
What were those like? Tell us about that.
Oh, it's funny. I mean, even to this day, people ask me about it all the time. It's like Morley Safer was in my house. I mean, you know, and I always say, and I didn't even commit a crime. I mean, I mean, how many people can say that? And I've got all these great pictures. I wish I could, well, I'll see if I can share this one that I had before. Is that up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, what a fantastic thing. I mean, it's like, this is one of the, like the highlights of my life. I'm never gonna forget this, to have him here and have him so interested in talking to me. I mean, my gosh.
Yeah, that was really incredible. Really incredible.
Unforgettable.
You felt the genuine interest that he had in talking about this subject.
He was a very nice fellow, and it pained me when we were at the cable car turnaround at the Embarcadero, and some of the Muni crew said, "It's great to meet you, Mr. Rather," and he frowned.
Yeah, well, you know, having been a local television reporter for some time, I'm sure that Morley Safer had a real whimsical attitude toward it, because you can't leave if you can't leave if you don't. You can't live if you don't. I don't know if this came up now, but this was a picture of Morley on the streetcar we used, just so you could see the streetcar we used, and he was like a little kid on the streetcar. I thought it was great.
When we were shooting here in the Niles Museum with the interview, we took a lunch break and went to the Nile Cafe for lunch. And on the way, we were stopped by a woman who told Morley, "My father really loves you" on 60 Minutes. And as we continued on, he muttered to himself, "Everybody's father and grandfather just loves 60 Minutes."
But that's when I think the average age of the anchors and the producer were in 85 to 89.
Yeah, they were
Venerable.
very successful, and the initial team really stayed together for quite some time. You know, Mike Wallace was working well into his late 80s there, and Morley into his 80s, and some fantastic pieces. We had a question saying, did we, what did it say? Do we have any, did Morley Safer share what he found especially appealing and likable about the story? Not with me, but I don't know if he mentioned it to you during the filming. Any of you?
I think he liked the film itself was, I think, very captivating to him. And we actually projected it on our screen at the theater and went through the whole thing watching it, and with him making comments about what a remarkable thing to see on the screen.
Yeah. Rick, do you know, and David, do either of you know of anything really comparable in American or even foreign cities, that length and detail on a main street or a location in that time era?
It's a genre known as the ride film. And there's a famous one from Vienna. There's a famous film, a POV out of the front of, I think, a streetcar going over the Brooklyn Bridge at the turn of the century that's not quite as long. I'm sure David will know of others, but you know, this was part of early cinema where before we started developing stories and narratives with actors, it was like sort of, you are there. This is the thrill of moving through space in a strange new environment. And you know, they still do this in Europe. You go to the London Underground Museum, you can buy a DVD of an hour ride on the Central Line looking out the front. In Norway and Germany, they play these videos on TV. So it's actually a genre that still is very much alive. But it was part of the thrill of the movies, you know, when they were very young.
Yeah, it must have been really something.
The Selig Polyscope specialized for a while just before this, shooting scenic films from a railroad car in the Rocky Mountains and other places. And the Miles brothers themselves shot a trip down Mount Tamalpais just before Trip Down Market Street, that one was copyrighted and a paper print was made. And so that one is available to see too. And so I think that's a very interesting one, going down the mountain and then coasting into Mill Valley.
Right. I was about to mention that film because that was made, I think, the year before or 2 years before.
Just a month before.
Really? Okay. Wow. And for those who don't know, Mount Tam had a very unusual gravity railroad where a steam engine would push a hill on what's still there as a fire trail. People hike on it all the time. A moderate, actually a gentle grade compared to most hiking trails. And then when they would get up there, the locomotive would detach and the thing just came down like a slalom with, you know, the train attendants braking it by hand, and you're gliding through the redwoods. have efforts been made to get a first quality, first quality print of that, higher quality resolution of that film?
I think the Library of Congress is capable of doing that. The original paper print was copied by Kim Niver onto 16 millimeter film. And the Library of Congress has got the scanning facilities now to do it in 35, so you'll get a much better quality. It's just a matter of taking the time and money to do it.
Is that an expensive process?
It's all expensive.
I mean, they can do it at the library for labor cost because they've got the people and the equipment. We scan for labor cost at Internet Archive, but the scanner that they would use for that is about $190,000 plus, the drives and the data infrastructure. I just, to back up to what people were saying just a few minutes ago, I don't know of any film that's that old, that's 115 years old, that can still captivate people. And that's, to me, the most amazing story. I mean, people relate to that film like it was shot in their own life, rather than just some kind of antiquarian object. I was in a cab one time talking with somebody about this film, and the driver turned around and said, "What happened to those kids at the end? What's the rest of the film?" And I mean, right? It's really unusual for history to speak so directly to people, and also history that's poignant but not negative. Nobody's getting killed in that film. I think it's wonderful.
I've seen it countless times, and I am fascinated every time.
Yeah, I see something new every time I watch it, and I have to train my eye, force my eye to look at the periphery, because the linearity of the rails kind of draws your eyes, and the ferry building tower at the end getting ever bigger kind of draws your eye straight down the street. But there's so much going on the side, and maybe one of Rick, you or David could explain very briefly this latest enhancement where you actually get a sort of wider screen view because of the information that's around the sprocket holes. Could you explain that very briefly? Because there's a lot of good stuff in between those sprocket holes.
Yeah, which nobody's ever seen because it was never, you couldn't see it when it was projected as a film. We just scanned the film edge to edge instead of cropping it. So you see the perforations, but you also see that there was picture between the perforations. So you can see a little bit more along the edges. Yeah, it's kind of neat.
Yeah. David, can you explain, Rena has cued me to ask why the trip down Market Street films and others like him were made. He said you should mention the boxing match that went short.
Yeah, the Miles brothers were unique at the time in that they had modified their cameras. Most cameras in the era were shooting with magazines that held 200 or 400 feet of film, which would last about
6 or 12 minutes, roughly.
3 minutes to 6 minutes of film. Whereas the Miles brothers put a 1,000-foot magazine on their film, so they could shoot a boxing match between Nelson and Britt in September 1905. And so they had 3 cameras outfitted with these 1,000-foot magazines that would last 15 to 16 minutes, depending on the cranking speed. And that enabled them to shoot these extremely long films without stopping. And that's why they shot the trip down Mount Tamalpais and the Market Street film, because they could.
Wow. So high tech at the time.
Cutting edge, yes.
Cutting edge, yes. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion. Does anyone have anything else to add that you would like to chime in with before we wrap up? No?
I just wonder if in their wildest dreams, they would have thought we'd still be talking about this film 115 years later.
Yeah.
I really
well,
just want to,
there's a really great question. You know, when you think about how fast cinema evolved, it was less than 10 years between this film and Birth of a Nation. You know, one of the, it's despicable, but it's one of the great first feature length films. What was it? How long did that run? 3 hours, 2.5 hours? It's forever.
Yeah.
And I mean, the technology went very fast, so you could understand why people would kind of, even by the late teens, early 20s, kind of just forget about this kind of thing as archaic. But you're right, it's kept its interest all along.
I just wanted to point out that if you want to see more, the museum's website will point you to that 4K transfer and also to a lot of historical information and other films that David has put together, so you can see this film in context. It's a generous assembly of material on the quake and fire.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and it's Niles Film Museum.org. If you look down at the bottom of the Zoom screen with Morley's picture, you'll see the name of the URL, Niles Film Museum.org, at the bottom. And I want to thank everybody for coming. It was
Thank you.
I learned a lot, and we'll have to do this again some other time.
Next year, same time, same station.
Yes.
Thanks to all of you gentlemen and to Rena for your generosity and, you know, making this film available, putting the work into making different versions publicly available to everybody, and just getting this history out into the open. I just think it's just a great example of public history and unselfishness.
And
Thanks, Frank.
spoken by one of the most unselfish people I know when it comes to sharing the past with people. I would mention that on the YouTube channel of our organization, Market Street Railway, you can see our narrated version at no charge. And so it's available there too, along with on YouTube, all the other versions, any assemblage of music or anything else you might like. So thank you all very much for coming. And with that, we'll call it a wrap.
Right.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.